So, hello and welcome along to another edition of Isolation Interviews for Hospital Radio Reading and for my YouTube channel. And I'm very excited. My guest today is a broadcast icon, the fantastic Jeremy Vine. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
Oh, Matthew, I'm fine. You know, the funny thing is that I feel like we had the pandemic and it's strangely gone. I know it hasn't gone, but I'm obviously thinking about the people who listen to this show in hospital, particularly. I just wonder I hope we're heading for happier times in this country anyway.
I mean, I was just thinking, you might not remember this, but we did meet just before the pandemic. You very kindly stopped outside Wogan House to have a photo with me and to have a quick chat. So it's so strange how in the last sort of 2 or so years, we've gone from everything normal to then suddenly a pandemic, and now we're kind of coming out the other side. I mean, how have you found it all?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I didn't expect there to be a lockdown, firstly, so I just didn't think the government could impose that. I don't think I realised how powerful the government could be when a lot of people would genuinely be worried about the virus. So I was surprised it happened. In March 2020, I went to a big quiz that was kind of a newsrooms quiz. That was a lot of people packed into a small room in the middle of March. Now, that must have been absolutely game on for Corona. Then there was a radio festival thing as well. And in retrospect, all those events were probably super spreader events. There were then some public events in the middle of March, which looking back, no one could believe happened. Liverpool, Atletico Madrid, the Stereophonics playing in Cardiff, Crufts happened, and Cheltenham, the races with 250,000 people. So then when lockdown happened, we all thought, oh my goodness. And we thought, you know, are we ever going to get out of this? And I suppose at the moment, the way it's worked, I'm quite amazed that it seems that Britain or maybe England is the first country in the world to get out. That's incredible. But we lost a lot of souls along the way. So I'm still, you know, I'm conscious that there's no cause for anyone to celebrate, but I'm thinking 2 years is enough of this thing now. We really need to crack on. And of course, now we're all distracted by events over to the east of us as well.
I mean, obviously for yourself, you're a very busy man doing the radio show and the TV show. So when the coronavirus pandemic first hit, how did it affect you on a day-to-day basis with you know, your jobs? Because obviously, you know, being in a TV studio and then onto a radio studio, how did that affect you?
Well, there are two different things going on. One of them is it makes the jobs more important. So I do Channel 5 in the mornings and then Radio 2. And in that sense, you know, audiences really want to know stuff. So we had a lot of Dr. Sara Jarvis in and so on. On the other hand, I mean, this is an extraordinary situation. It became more difficult to broadcast. I never thought I'd say that. We had to lose the audience on Channel 5. So we haven't yet got them back actually either. And we had to do a lot of distancing. We had very few guests. We had a lot of people come on down the line. The people who make the Channel 5 show are ITM Productions, and they did an absolutely brilliant job of keeping the show going, because there might have been a point at which, if it wasn't for Sara Jarvis coming in every other day, we got to fill 2 hours. We might not have been able to. But there was a lot of news, you know, and in the end, excuse me, a news program is all about that kind of period, that kind of time. And we've had such a bizarre time because we had Brexit and Trump in the same year. And then obviously we had COVID, now we've got Ukraine. We've had the busiest time in news since the 60s, since the JFK assassination, I would say.
And I mean, obviously, you know, the whole thing has obviously been tough on a lot of people, but I imagine when you're kind of doing these stories that directly not just impact your listeners, but also impacting you. I mean, I imagine that must be tough and a bit scary at times when you don't know what's around the corner.
I remember actually, Matthew, just during the pandemic, we said, you know, why don't we give some messages to the NHS, and would your child like to be photographed doing something to thank the NHS? And we had literally hundreds and hundreds of weeks, because the ITN building was empty. We plastered them all up and down the walls and the corridors in the front reception and everything else. And it was really moving to just think, oh, and it's the same for you with your radio station. There are people listening to this. Isn't that an incredible thought as a broadcaster? And to be honest, it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 1 million or what. It doesn't really matter. The fact that you're there because they're there. So that meant a lot. I think yeah, I mean, the pain of it. The first time it came home to me, actually, I was in the street, and it was probably April 2020. And I heard, and we were all in lockdown, so it was my family were out walking, doing our one walk of the day. And I heard applause from the other end of the street, and I thought, that's really A, weird, and B, inappropriate. And I walked up to see what was happening. And actually, it was a neighbour further down who I didn't know, who died of COVID. And at that moment, I thought, this is going to be very serious. We've lost somebody in my street, can you imagine? And I think during the thing that'll stay with me is just the tales of real agony of people, particularly people maybe about my age, who lost mums or dads but couldn't see them, couldn't go to funerals. And then we discover there's been 16 parties in Downing Street. I mean, it's just infuriating for so many people.
I mean, that's another thing that I think this last couple of years has really brought to the forefront of people's minds. And that's the amazing work that the NHS do. Any key workers who go out day in, day out. I mean, for you, how, you know, what's your kind of opinion been and response been to just the amazing work they do?
Yeah, I mean, the NHS incredible. There are other groups of people where I think there was, you know, there was more of a debate about whether, for example, the teachers could have done more. And I know people who are teachers who are listening think, oh, you know, thank you very much. But I know that there was just a sense that the schools shut too easily. And I think looking back, we would, if this happened again, the government would do everything in its power to stop shutting the schools as it did. And it couldn't really get them opened again for a long time. I mean, pupils lost more than a year of their schoolwork. And it was terrible for equality. It was terrible for people who haven't got Wi-Fi, haven't got iPads and everything, which is a lot of people. So that, you know, there is a bit of a question mark there. And I would also say, in terms of key workers, we suddenly realized that the key workers are not necessarily just the NHS who we love, but they're also the people who work at your local M&S and your Aldi and your Lidl, because they were actually properly up front, you know, up close and personal with customers, and they were getting it and going ill and everything. And they were needed just as much. So I think and I was always embarrassed because journalists technically are key workers. So I was allowed to travel into work at the very height of the pandemic. You know, I was cycling into London and all the streets were deserted. It was absolutely weird. I felt really kind of like I was quite guilty once because I on my way home, I thought I wanted to go and see for the first time the street where the photograph of David Bowie on the cover of the Ziggy Stardust album was taken. And I thought, well, I'm not doing anything and I'll just go via that street. It was only about, you know, probably a 600-yard sort of detour on my way home, but I felt guilty doing it. I thought, well, this is now an unnecessary journey. But, you know, so the fact that journalists were designated as key workers always struck me as a bit, I mean, we are, I don't know, we don't feel like key workers. Let me put it like that. It made us feel a bit guilty. But it also gave us a bit of an insight into the sheer level that lockdown reached at its peak. It was very, very, very quiet everywhere. And to the point where one day I was able to cycle the wrong way down Park Lane, which is, you know, you'll never do in 100 years, incredibly.
And I just wanted to briefly, obviously, double check, because you did recently fall off your bike. How are you? I just wanted to double check.
Well, my bike is behind me. I thought you'd like this. So what can I say? I mean, I've been learning to ride it for about 3 or 4 years. In the lockdown, for some reason, this story started that people had started riding penny farthing. So I kept being asked for comments on where this had come from and why had I started. I said, well, I actually got mine a couple of years ago just for crazy reasons. I saw somebody cycling on one and I thought I'd quite fancy that. So I got it. I learned to ride on it. The thing I've learned, I mean, the reason, by the way, it's that shape is because they didn't have chains back in the day. So they needed to have a very, very big front wheel. But I went on grass, and that was a fatal error because you can't necessarily see, you know, the bumps and the lips and the divots. I hit some kind of divot. I don't know what it was. The last thing I remember, I was thrown off the handlebars. I just remember myself in midair, and apparently I did some kind of somersault. I was unconscious for a minute or two. And then I went to A&E and gradually came back. And thankfully, I didn't have a single broken bone, amazingly, and I'm okay. And I said, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that this is a very strange accident to have because as far as I'm aware, there are very few accidents on penny farthings. So I had considered them to be completely safe. And then a lovely bloke in the Investors Chronicle wrote a whole article about how this was a basic failure to understand statistics. I thought, yeah, okay, fair enough. But I have been out on it since then. So it's the most beautiful machine. That front wheel you can see there is 56 inches. So the saddle, which is just above the screen, is basically at the height of my collarbone when I'm standing. So I was 8 foot up in the air. My head was 8 foot up. It's quite a long way down. So I was very lucky. And the A&E people, speaking of the NHS, the A&E were absolutely brilliant.
I mean, I know that when Storm and of course Claudia Liza were talking about it and mentioning it on the show, I think they maybe implied that maybe you're best to sort of stay away from that. Do you think that you'll ever be put off riding it, or will you
Well,
continue?
I wonder, when I went back on it, I wondered whether I would feel some qualms, but I didn't. I think probably because I wasn't badly hurt. I could have broken my neck. I mean, I was very, very lucky, but I just mustn't go on grass again. The main thing is I understood what had happened. If it had suddenly stopped for no reason, that would have thrown my confidence. But it stopped because I was very silly and I went on grass. But I think I'm going to now only cycle up with the supervision of my wife. So she'll come out with me and she can say, when it's clear and when it's not. But it is a joyful thing. And I'm convinced they're safer than normal bicycles because the drivers really, really notice them. Whereas with a normal bicycle, they probably don't. So I'm sticking with that.
Now, I wanted to go back to where it all began for you. Do you remember where you first became interested in broadcasting and that kind of area? Do you remember where that was for you, where it started?
Oh, yeah. I was, there was a key day. I was 12 years old and I went into Capital Radio and they had a young DJ slot and I'd written in, and basically the slot was on a program called Hullabaloo, presented by Maggie Norden. And essentially they would have someone, say, hello, this is me, and these are my records. And I did that, and I played very bad records. I played James Galway, Annie's song, Good Luck Charm by Elvis. I mean, great records, but not a good choice for a 12-year-old. I think my mum chose them probably. And I just remember thinking that's what I want to do. And I had a little glimpse of Kenny Everett, my hero, my radio hero. So a lot of people actually don't know who he was now because he had a TV series that was quite high impact, but his best work was on Capital Radio when I was a teenager. So I used to stay in and listen to his show. I used to love it. And that just totally inspired me. And then I had this radio station we had at home, myself and my brother, called Drainpipe Radio, which was basically us playing music out of a cassette recorder down a drain pipe and forcing my parents to listen. And we would do that thing together. And that, I think, I don't know, that I did some hospital radio and I did metro radio when I was a student once a week. I was amazed to get paid for it. I was paid £8 an hour on air. So I got £24 a week from metro radio. That was a big thing. And I just loved the sort of simplicity of it. And funnily enough, I mean, the first job I had actually after university was as a newspaper trainee at the Coventry Evening Telegraph, which was an amazing experience. But newspapers were really not slaughtered, but they were smashed a lot by the internet, and they've never been the same since. Whereas radio's continued. Radio's doing really, really well. It's survived the internet avalanche. So just by sheer luck, I picked the right career.
And I mean, just briefly, obviously, we'll go back to your time on hospital radio. What were your kind of experiences like on hospital radio? How did you find it?
So let's just think, because my hospital radio stint was basically probably mostly at Dryburn Hospital Radio in Durham. So I was a student and I walked this long and lonely walk up to the Dryburn Hospital and I found the little shed where they did hospital radio and I made friends with a couple of people and then I did some presenting. And somebody said to me and then I actually presented as well on Banstead Hospital Radio in near where I lived in Cheam. And that was different because Banstead was what was called a mental hospital. And they closed so many of them now, and they're now caring the community and all that. But doing a hospital radio station in what was, I suppose you'd call it a psychiatric hospital, was quite a strange thing for a teenage me. And what I found really difficult was that somebody said to me, you can only do hospital radio if you go around the wards and you speak to the patients. There's no point just locking yourself in a studio. So I used to go around, and I just remember, this was in the 80s, there was some people in, quite serious distress. And I think it was quite an unusual thing. You could almost write a book about it, what you learn. But I suppose fundamentally the lesson there is that you have to know your audience, and whether you're broadcasting to people who are psychiatric patients or who've got broken legs or who are, as with Radio 2, young mums and pensioners and van drivers, you just have to know who they are. So it starts with one listener.
And I mean, obviously recently, I think it was last week, you did a feature on your Radio 2 show about hospital radio and obviously got people involved. What was the response like from people when you kind of sort of say you're doing a story like, for example, hospital radio? What's the kind of response from the audience?
Well, it's funny. I think people who listen to the radio, and particularly if you've been listening for quite a while, so if I'm in my mid-50s now, people of my age and above, the radio has been a companion to them for a long time, and they sort of love it. And in a way, it's like loving football. You can be quite an expert in all the players. You're quite interested. You know, if I say Terry Wogan to a Radio 2 listener, they just know instantly. They can almost picture him standing in front of them. They know what he's like, to bless him, you know, what he sounds like. They know his sensitivity. They know everything. And so people get very engrossed in radio. It came home to me a couple of years ago. We had they decided to do some children in need fundraising, and each presenter had to offer something, you know. And mine one was a trip around the Tower of London, and then Ken Bruce's one was, I don't know, go and, you know, sort of see something or other, flower show. Steve Wright's one was just come and see Steve Wright, and it broke all the records, because we realized the only thing you want to do if you're bidding for it is just to come into the studio and meet Steve Wright. That's all you want to do. And so when we did this hospital radio item, we started with this premise that there had been 350 hospital radio stations in the 80s, and there were now 175. And of course, what tends to happen is you just get people ringing up saying, well, I love mine. And it just turned into, although it should have been a sad item about why they were closing down, it turned into kind of a surprisingly joyful one, that people saying, look, mine is still going and it's brilliant. And yeah, again, it's partly also the enthusiasm of the volunteers, the people who work on them, like yourself, Matthew. You know, that's what it's rooted in. So I love doing pieces on the radio about the radio. Are a joyful thing.
I mean, have you always been interested in kind of human interest topics? And because obviously, you know, both your Channel 5 show and your Radio 2 show, you know, focus on kind of news and what's going on in the world. Has that always been your kind of interest in radio, in that topic?
Well, it's journalism, yes. I suppose when I was 12, 13 and I did that young DJ slot, I wanted to be a DJ and I wanted to play records. And my mum said, you know, always good career advice. Maybe being a disc jockey is not going to be long-term forever for you to do. Maybe you want something else. And I said, no. All I want to do is play records. Actually, as I got older in my teenage years, I thought actually journalism was where it's at, because it's just always interesting. You never have a dull day. And I was on the student newspaper, and then, as I say, Coventry, Evening Telegraph, and I kind of forgot about the music. And it was only by one of those it was kind of a tear in the fabric of the universe at the BBC that I ended up dropping through the ceiling on Radio 2 and ending up in Jimmy Young's chair and playing, what was it, Thunder Road as my first record in 2003. And then I finally, at the age of 42, became a DJ, which I'd always, you know, or was it? No, hang on, 37. I'd always, you know, I thought I'd avoid it, and I suddenly ended up playing records and interviewing the Prime Minister. So I've got the best job ever. You know, it's made for me. And I always wish I'd met Jimmy Young, so I could have thanked him because he developed the whole thing. But yeah, I think at the heart of what I do is the news. And I have a bit of insecurity, I suppose, in that I watch Ken Bruce do his job, or Sara Cox, who's one of my best friends on the radio, or, you know, Terry when he was alive. And I don't know how they do it without any material. And I've got this fear, it's not a fear, it's a reality, that I am not really interesting enough to carry 2 hours, and I need material. And I am really passionately interested in the news. And it came home to me, well, I was at university in the 80s, and there was a thing called the Westland Affair, which you'll know about if you love your current affairs. But basically, there was a row between Heseltine and Thatcher. Heseltine resigned and eventually brought Thatcher down. And it was 1985, and I was 20. And it was like a light going on. I thought, I'm fascinated by politics. I love the human drama of politics, and I've never stopped being fascinated. And then in the 90s, I was just, again, a BBC thing where the John Major had got re-elected in 1992. There was a big thing that maybe there wouldn't be any more interesting elections and all that sort of nonsense. And then suddenly the whole Europe debate started in Maastricht, and they needed more political correspondence. And I was 27, and I was given this 6 months attachment there. And I went in with Hugh Edwards to the House of Commons, and he stood me in the corridor, and he just talked me through all the MPs coming down. I'll never forget it. And I just thought, oh my God, this is like being in a movie. I couldn't believe I'm right. And that's the great thing about journalism. You're not just ringside, you're in the ring. And to me, I just couldn't believe that I was there, you know. And I've always loved news. I've always found it fascinating. But I think the thing about Radio 2 and Channel 5 is it's the kind of news that isn't the Newsnight kind of news, which is when you have, you know, the tablets are thrown down from the mountaintop by the all-knowing presenter, which is a very old-fashioned model, much as I love those programs. It's more to do with, we don't know what the news is until the audience tell us. and call us now and tell us. And so we can look quite confused at the start of a show, and it's only when the audience get in touch that we get straightened down. So I feel I've sort of discovered, in a way, my true self. And I think those, I used to, I don't know, it's a very difficult thing. Oh, the great quandary, I'll leave this, with your listeners to decide, is whether news is about me or whether news is about someone else. And by that I mean, I was listening to a speech by a newspaper editor, and he was the Kent Messenger, and he was doing it, and he said, we had this young babies competition of send us a picture of your baby, and our readership went up. And then we said we did send us more pictures, and it went up again. And then basically we decided we're going to fill all the papers with pictures of readers' babies. And the readership figures went through the roof, and we suddenly realized news is just about opening the paper and seeing a picture of your own baby. And he said, news is about me. And I thought, okay, this is the opposite. This really hit me, because I thought this is the opposite of what I thought news was. Because I thought news was about me being, as I was, Africa correspondent, and going to parts of the world where the audience couldn't go to, and bringing back news about other people. And I've never really worked it out. Is news about me, or is news about other people? And I suppose maybe we'll never solve that one.
I mean, the other thing I wanted to obviously ask about is working at Wogan House, on Radio 2. I know there are a lot of people out there that would be the dream job, would be the kind of thing they, top of the bucket list. For you to have that as your day job, do you sort of find yourself having to pinch yourself? Do you sort of quite believe that you're there?
Oh, what a great question. And I know you've stood outside the building, so you know this. During the pandemic, it's been weird because it's just been a building. And so I'm reminded, because of the pandemic, of what it was like before and what it's like normally. And, I got in the lift once, and there's a guy in there called Nick Cave, and he's a very famous punk singer. He's still famous now, actually, but his band was The Birthday Party, and their most famous song, released in about 1979, was Release the Bats. And it was just silent in the lift, me, him, and somebody else. And I just said, release the bats. And he just said, they don't write them like that anymore. And another time I got in the lift, and there was George Michael in there, bless him. And then once we prepare the show on the second floor, and at about probably 11 o'clock, Ken Bruce said, and coming up after this record is Carole King, and she's going to play It's Too Late. And I said, guys, Carole King is 4 floors above us at the Radio 2 piano, and she's going to play It's Too Late. We have to go up. And of course, the producers, researchers are all 25, so they were kind of thinking, they weren't sure about the necessity. But that's the joy of it, isn't it? I mean, it's funny that, in a way, you get more thrills like that in a radio station than you do in a TV station. We had a thing where I was interviewing Hillary Clinton, and she turned up for some reason 2 hours early on her own and just sat there with a cup of coffee, and we all just had a chat with her. It's moments like that you live for. Or the moment when Tony Benn met Jordan in the green room, and Jordan was in for Steve Wright, and Tony Benn was in for my show, and he came through to me and said, I've just met the most remarkable woman. I think her name was Gordon. So, yeah, incredible place to be. Lift doors open and Gary Newman steps out.
I mean, I say the day that
and also, by the way, I was going to say, the addition to that is my actual colleagues, because, it always breaks my heart that if Kenny Everett hadn't died of AIDS in 1991, he would definitely be on Radio 2, and I'd be able to just tell him how much his broadcasting meant to me as a teenager, and how without him I wouldn't have done it. But also, to share the lift with Wogan, Ken Bruce, to see Bob Harris around the building. You've got Tony Blackburn, the first voice on Radio 1 in 1967. I would see him the whole time. Gambaccini, Sara, Joe Wiley. I mean, it's an astonishing place, because the radio family has got some serious legends in it, and they're walking down the corridors. It's incredible.
I mean, I was just going to say that the day that obviously I met you outside Wogan House, I also ended up having, I think Pete Townsend was visiting Radio 2 that day. And also I was there to interview Steve Wright. So did an interview with him in his studio, which again, for someone like me, that was just amazing, surreal, because I believe he started his radio career in the Reading area. So I mean, it's just a building full of legends, and I mean, anyone I imagine would chew your right arm off to get that job. So yeah, I imagine for yourself it is just. I mean, do you kind of when you kind of obviously, because being on the radio, being on the telly, fame is something that comes with it. Is that something you enjoy? Is that something that you like, or is it weird for you?
Well, I don't, you know, what's funny is that I think my generation, which is, you know, obviously Sara and Joe Wiley and so on, we don't consider ourselves to be famous in the way that the greats are. So I don't think we put ourselves in that category. And I don't really see it that way. I mean, in London, I think everyone's famous. You know, you don't get recognised by anybody in London. You get recognised a bit when you go outside. It's a funny one. I can't really quantify it, to be honest. I don't. I mean, yeah, I suppose when I fell off my penny farthing and I went to A&E, they were kind of interested. That, you know, I could sense that people were saying, he got Jeremy Vine in the ward and he's fallen off a penny farthing. I did sense that, but for the most part, it doesn't make much odds, because I don't think I'm in that category. See, I think that all of us, and I'm thinking here of Fiona Bruce and people like Hugh Edwards, John Sopel, we operate at a huge discount, which is that we basically have factored in our own sackings. So we just assume that one day it'll all end, and we're perfectly happy with that. Whereas the previous generation didn't think it would ever end. And so when it did, it was awful. And I think we've this is all too complicated, but I think we so discounted our own professional demise that we all almost operate as if it's already happened. So in the short answer to your question is, I don't feel famous at all, no.
And just very briefly, what is a typical day like for you when you're working? Because I imagine literally you go straight from Channel 5 to the Radio 2 show. So how do you manage to fit it all in? What is a typical day like for you?
Well, my alarm goes off at 4:42. I get up, I have a shower, have a cup of tea, cycle into Channel 5, get in for a 6:30 meeting, usually do some graphics for them, talk about the items. Do that show, brilliant, love it. Come out 10:30, get on my bike 10:41, in Radio 2 by 5 to 11. I mean, I know it sounds a bit regimented, but that's exactly what happened today and yesterday and will happen tomorrow. So it's and Channel 5's just been extended as well. So Storm Huntley, my co-presenter, does another hour, which is fantastic for the show. But it's within that I know that's all structured. But actually, of course, the key variable is the actual stories and the guests, and that's the key thing. So the actual structure is neither here nor there. I mean, today we did, you know, a young woman who'd been savaged by a crocodile in Zambia. She'd fallen in a river, and a crocodile had bitten her foot off. It had been hanging by a thread. So I hope there's nobody in the Reading Hospital who's got this particular injury. And she'd somehow managed to get out, to be pulled out by her friends, and she was okay and recovering. And she's had 7 operations, and she's doing well. You know, I just thought, oh my goodness. I don't, you know, what time I got up this morning doesn't matter, because every day is different. That's the joy of journalism. Every day is completely and utterly different. And it's by definition, it can't be boring. I mean, absolutely by definition. Today we did something yesterday about just the sort of all the questions you want to know about Ukraine that you haven't asked. And we had this brilliant defense expert in, and they were fantastic questions from the audience about, you know, if you have a no-fly zone, can you take out artillery on the ground and stuff? Absolutely brilliant. So I you know, the answer to your question is the day is very structured, and at the same time it's completely and utterly unknowable. I have no idea what I'm doing tomorrow, no idea at all.
I mean, obviously going forward, is what you're doing now the dream? Is there something else you would love to do going forward that you haven't had the chance to do yet?
I'd love to write a best-selling novel. I'm always trying to think of a plot to one, but I think that probably describes half the people in this country. No, do you know, I love Radio 2. I think the thing about television is you make a splash with one big show. It's about impact. The thing about radio is it's about something that's enduring. It's about doing 1,000 shows. So TV is one show, radio is 1,000. I worked out recently, I've asked 42,000 questions on Eggheads. I mean, that's another whole other thing, because that show, I don't know how it's still doing it, but it really is. But I love what I do, you know, and broadcasters are very easy to please, actually. If you give them a microphone and you turn a red light on, even if it's not connected to anything, they'll be happy, you know, and that's me. I don't find myself foraging around looking for other stuff.
Now, I just want to say it's been a pleasure talking to you, but before we go, is there any messages you'd like to give to anyone who's currently stuck in the Royal Berks here in Reading at the moment? Anyone that you know, any messages for the people in hospital?
Oh, well, listen, this is from me, Jeremy Vine, to you, wherever you are in the Royal Berks. I know that, particularly if you're there because of an accident or something's happened suddenly in your life or an operation's gone wrong, there will be low moments. So I hope you'll let the radio carry you through, and Matthew's brilliant show. And I always think if you just find a window somewhere and look out and see a little chink of light and think one day the light will get a bit bigger, I'll be on my feet again, up and out, and all the best. I'm sure it'll happen. Get well soon.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's been an absolute pleasure. Of course, keep safe, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thanks, Matthew. Cheers.